Hi everyone. I'm going to be talking about the three-story thesis, which is an idea that came from a college writing teacher somewhere else, but I first found out about it from my colleagues at a community college in Southern California. It's a very powerful idea for writing a good thesis if you're in a college writing class, and I'm going to be specifically talking about how it might apply in this book. If you're in a college writing class, and a lot of them around the country do use this book, you can use some of these ideas to maybe think of a more interesting thesis for a paper you might have to write. And my classes all use this, but even if yours don't, I hope this might illustrate the three-story thesis in terms you can understand, maybe a little bit more clearly than those in the original document, which I will link to at the end of the presentation. Okay, so the idea of the three-story thesis is basically that you should write a more deep and meaningful and interesting thesis, and one that is not just saying basic facts that anyone knows or anyone who read your book knows. And the stories in this case refer to the stories of a building or the floors of a building. 3 stories is better in this case. And 1 story might be fine for a house, but you don't want a thesis with 1 story, as you'll see. Again, stories are the floors of a house, not stories like the story of Cinderella or something like that. That's a different kind of story. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of a thesis for a prompt from Power of Habit. And some of you might have a prompt that looks like this as your second or third essay if you're in a class that's reading Power of Habit, where you have to apply Duhigg's theories to something that you already know, something about your habits or something that everybody is familiar with. So this particular prompt is discuss the role of Duhigg's theories of habit formation and change in smartphone use. It's pretty open-ended. We can imagine a lot of ways to answer this question. If you have read Duhigg's book, you probably already can tell the teacher probably wants you to use chapters 1, 2, and 3 at least to answer this question, right? And you have to talk about smartphones, but that's a topic everybody knows, so that shouldn't be too hard. Okay, so that's our prompt, and all of the examples that I give are going to be about this prompt for now. Okay, so first there's a 1-story thesis, and a 1-story thesis is basically not a good thesis because it's not an argument. As you can see on the label on the building, it says facts. A 1-story thesis is basically stating a fact from the book that you read. And it's not making an argument because anybody who has read the same book would know the same thing. So it's not a good thesis. First of all, nobody can disagree with it, okay? If you say, like, Elsa and Anna are sisters, yeah, I saw that movie, that's true. There's nothing to disagree with, and therefore there's no reason to write an essay about that, okay? Because nobody can disagree with it, there's no reason to support it, and really there's no way that you can. You can't write a whole essay about the ways that Elsa and Anna are sisters. Anna or Anna? So it's the same if you're writing an essay about, for example, the power of habit. Something like this, the habit loop has 3 parts, is not a good thesis, especially not for the prompt that we had, because there's no argument here. Nobody could disagree. If they read this book, they know this because it's a very fundamental part, very basic part of Duhigg's theory of habit formation. Okay, so it's not a good thesis. It's not a good thesis because nobody could disagree with it. There's no argument to be made. And then even more seriously, it doesn't answer the question. The prompt asks you to discuss the role of Duhigg's theories in smartphone use. There's nothing about smartphones here, which brings me to the next slide, which is actually not the 2nd-story thesis, it's something different, the 0-story thesis. This is not part of the official theory of the 3-story thesis. It's not part of the original person who thought of this idea, but I thought I should include this because this is a danger that academic writing teachers see very often. The danger is that you might not even answer the question in your thesis. You might not answer the prompt. The most common version of this is an announcement. For example, in this paper, I will discuss the role of habits in smartphone use. Yeah, so please do that. Don't tell me that you're going to do it, just do it. It's a zero-story thesis. I call it a zero-story thesis because it doesn't even answer the question. Really, the last thesis, the one about the habit loop has 3 parts, is also a zero-story thesis because it doesn't answer the question in the prompt. Just be careful. When you're writing a thesis, make sure you read the prompt and make sure you're actually answering the question. Getting a thesis like this is sort of like getting a math problem where the answer is, I will tell you the answer. Just tell me the answer. Okay, so those are 2 bad examples. A 1-story thesis, which is just facts, a 0-story thesis, which isn't even answering the question, isn't even answering the prompt. So on to the more successful examples of a thesis. A 2-story thesis answers the question in the prompt and also presents an argument. An argument is something that's not obvious, okay? If someone else read the same book, they should not just know that what you said is true. You still have to prove it. So it's not something like the habit loop has 3 parts that anybody who read the book would know, okay? And because it's not obvious, you can imagine someone disagreeing with it. You can imagine someone saying, well, wait, you have to prove that that's true, right? And that's why you have to support it. That's why you have to give body paragraphs that prove that your thesis is true. Now, an example for this essay might be, the craving makes all rewards of smartphone use the same, avoiding the frustration of not checking a notification. So this answers the question, right? It gives some role of one of Duhigg's theories, in this case, craving, in smartphone use. And it makes a claim that's not obvious, right? So you can read Duhigg's book and think, oh, that's interesting about craving, and still not agree that the rewards are all the same when you have a strong craving. You would want to hear someone's reasons for that, and then especially the reasons that they say that the rewards for smartphone use because of craving all end up being the same thing, which is just not being frustrated that you're not checking your notifications. So it is an argument. You want to hear more about it. You want to hear this person's reasons, okay? So there's also a 3-story thesis, and this one is definitely the hardest because it takes the most thought. It takes what we often want, which is critical thinking, right? So I call this floor meaning. I think the original author uses a different term for this, but the meaning of your argument might not be something that's in the prompt, but it is something that you learned by making your argument, right? It's so some deeper significance, implication, or meaning of your argument that isn't necessarily part of the answer to the question itself, okay? So again, writing teachers really like these because they show that you thought deeply about the subject. And, critical thinking is a word that we use a lot. We really like to see evidence that students are thinking hard about what the concepts that they've learned really mean, not just in answer to the narrow question that the teacher asked, but maybe in other areas or beyond at least what the teacher asked to do as the minimum. Okay, so a possible example for this essay might be the fact that a smartphone contains cues and rewards for a wide variety of habits prevents applications of the golden rule for those habits and cultivates addiction. So the bigger meaning here is cultivates addiction. That's not something that was in the prompt. The prompt didn't ask about addiction, but this is something that I learned by thinking about how a smartphone prevents you from applying the golden rule. If you've read Duhigg's book, you'll know what I mean by golden rule. Basically, you have to keep the cue for your habit and keep the reward, but change the routine. And that's impossible when the cue and the reward are both inside of the same program. You can't just decide, for example, to see a Facebook notification and then call your friend, right? And then somehow feel the same reward. The design of Facebook makes that impossible. And this, I want you to notice also, this still answers the question, right? It still gives a role that Duhigg's theories play in smartphone use, right? It also just takes that a little bit farther and gives a deeper meaning to that. It says, well, then maybe that's why smartphone addiction exists. Okay. Now, this isn't necessarily going to be a good essay, but this essay meets what we think of as the criteria of a 3-story thesis. Okay, so I'm going to break down this a little bit. I mean, I guess I already did this, but just to be clear, it answers the prompt and it gives a deeper meaning or implication. That's what we look for when we're talking about a 3-story thesis. So there's a formula that you can use that would make this a little bit easier if you're not sure if your thesis is a 2-story thesis or a 3-story thesis yet. Okay, I'm changing the prompt here because I don't want to just repeat my same example, but let's say the prompt here is explain how a habit of yours matches or does not match Duhigg's description of how a habit is formed. That's a very common prompt for a first essay when you're using Duhigg as your class text. So a formula for a 3-story thesis might be, first, make sure you answer the prompt, and second, give the deeper meaning of the argument. Okay, so for example, my habit of eating chips in front of the television matches Duhigg's descriptions of the habit loop and craving. That answers the prompt, which shows that parts of habits can act as the cues for different habits. So that's the deeper meaning, okay? So when I'm writing an example essay for my students, I want to make sure it has a 3rd story. I always add another section to the thesis that says, which means, which shows, which demonstrates, or something like that. That can be a very clear 3rd story, and your teacher will see that too, I hope. Okay, all right, so that's it. That's it for my explanation. If you want to go and read the original article, the link is right here. This itself apparently was adapted from another article, and I haven't read that one, but feel free to do that. All right, good luck.